Hello, my name is Barbin. I am a master's seeking student here at American University in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining me today. Today I will be embarking on a brief history and a journey through the religious education in the subcontinent of India, especially in the pre-colonial, immediate pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial spaces. My intention is to dive into indigenous forms of religious education and history. Specifically, today we're going to focus on Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim forms of religious education, as well as diving into how British intervention brought Christianity as a tool for the subjugation of the state and as an imperial sort of conditioning tool. And hopefully at the end of this video we will get into some post-colonial forms of education, how some of these indigenous forms of religious education especially are seeing a comeback, how some of those are still coded in the British sort of way and format of education, and how some of these newer forms of education are still perpetuating some of these forms and systems of oppression that we saw under colonial rule. At the top of this video, I'd like to specify a couple of clarifying comments. I am a white man, and although the content of this video is researched and information driven, that it is possible that I will make mistakes and biases, and this is not my own cultural heritage, though it is a personal point of interest and fascination. So there will be mistakes, very, very likely there will be mistakes, and there also will be presumably points of unexamined biases. These are unintentional, and I will strive to correct them and make points of clarity about them. That being said, I assume that I will miss some of that, and that some of those will seep through. The point of this is just to say that I am a fallible narrator, though I will try to provide you with cleanly sourced information as much as possible. Secondarily, today I will be referring to India broadly, and the topic of this video is ideally centered on the modern state of India. That being said, the colonial and pre-colonial empire of India includes spaces that are now Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, among others. So I will point those out whenever they arise. That being said, I will be referring broadly to the subcontinent of India. And we'll dive right in. As we begin in an overview of the religious and educational history of the continent of India, it's important at the top to remind ourselves that India is a vastly diverse cultural and religious continent, and that the history of these people is not monolithic, and has over the last 5,000 years changed hands and principalities and oversight and administration, and that goes to say that while some of these traditions that we're going to speak about today, some of these types of schooling have seen their rise and fall, that these experiences are diverse. These experiences have changed over time. Some of them have, and frankly, some of them have not. But that these represent the cultural interests, the needs of the time, and the spiritual justification of these people over thousands and thousands of years. Today we will talk briefly about the history of Hindu education, Buddhist monastic traditions, some of the oldest universities in the world, as well as Muslim madrasas and state universities that have risen, fallen, um, become ruins in ancient history, or are still in our recent memory, um, all in a very brief amount of time. So these traditions and these histories and these types, these frameworks of understanding, um, very much are rooted in a sense of time that is almost alien to us as Americans. A scope of time that is literally thousands of years old, and a sense of tradition that does not exist in our westernized mindset of time, understanding, and organization.
We will begin today with the Gurukul system, the Hindu Gurukul system. Um, this is a form of Hindu traditional schooling that has existed in its primary form for almost 3,000 years. It is mentioned in some of the earliest Vedic texts uh, that originate from almost 1,000 BCE. And this is a deeply localized education practice that involves small groups of students or shishyas that live and learn in close proximity to their teachers, their gurus. Um, this is some of the earliest format of education in India. It's some of the most accessible over time. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. But the Gurukul system is focused on a collaborative learning environment between these small classes of shishyas, these students, cooperative learning spaces, and with a heavy focus on pupil and teacher interactions. It is centered on the development of a holistic education, language, mathematics, sciences, arts, and music. It is the basis of a traditional Hindu education, what every young and upcoming, mostly upper class Hindu boy specifically should learn and develop. Entry into the Gurukul system held very few requirements and generally held no tuition or fee structure outside of the Guru Dakshina, which is a traditional offering from the student to the Guru, which may be monetary depending on the student and the family. It may be food, or it could be a task that's accepted by the student on behalf of his guru, something that he is undertaking to prove his worthiness and his respect to his teacher. Um, the broad accessibility of the Gurukul and its low cost sort of holistic education at the local and village level made it one of the more widespread options for education across the subcontinent prior to the colonial period. Though it did see its, as we talked about earlier, its rises and falls as the hands and administration of the broader subcontinent changes hands. When discussing Hindu forms of education, uh, even the more comparatively open systems like the Gurukul, it is important to acknowledge that formalized education was an option that was mostly reserved for Hindu upper castes. So Brahmins, um, the priestly caste, Rajanyas, rulers, administrative individuals, warriors, and vaishyas, artisans and merchants. These were the sort of upper crust of society, and these were um, even some of these, even the last two that I listed here, were limited and barred from some forms of education. Most forms of education were only available to Brahmins, that upper class, those religious individuals who were born into Brahmanism. Individuals and members of the lower caste, Shudras, the labor class, and Dalits, untouchables, they technically aren't even classified in the caste system, are almost exclusively barred from the right to participate in a formalized education. This will change over time and is the subject of quite a bit of reform, debate, and national conversation in Indian history, but that does not happen quite a bit later in the colonial and post-colonial landscapes. Next, we are going to examine Buddhist monastic traditions and the schools that are built within them, the vihara. Buddhism in India originated as an offshoot of Hinduism in the early 6th century BCE. So Buddhism has been deeply intertwined with the state of India and sort of its educational upbringing since very early on. And Buddhist education has to do primarily with the salvation of the soul, the spiritual salvation of its students, and is used traditionally as an initiation ceremony and a process for learning in preparation for becoming a Buddhist monk. That is not necessarily the case anymore, but in its earliest iterations, that was the primary motivation for a Buddhist education. Monks were instructed in Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics. The earliest that a seeker could come to learn and join these monastic schools, these vihara, was 8 years old. In which case, these monks would be given, these very young monks would be given a primary education, instructed in reading, writing, arithmetic, and philosophy. The period of education in this style, in this Vihara lifestyle, was 12 years, after which a Shraman, a seeker, could present himself before the other monks in his Vihara to be voted on for admittance as a full monk, a full member of their society in a ceremony that is known as an upsampada, excuse me. Sangha life in these monasteries was residential, and so over this period of 12 years, relationships between teachers and students became deeply personal, became very familiar. These were relationships that were cultivated over time. Usually these monks operated in small classes with a dedicated teacher that did not change. So these relationships were very much built on respect and understanding that was cultivated. Overall, the goal for these students, for these monks, was the creation of discipline and the sort of building of wisdom in the philosophy and style of these Buddhist traditions. Viharas form some of the earliest instances of what we would now understand as residential universities in history. Nalanda was a Buddhist monastic university in the modern state of Bihar, which served as a major center of learning for more than 750 years, between 427 and 1197. And was a critical site for the development of several schools of Buddhist thought, and was a major player in the development of Eastern Asian Buddhism, which was truly fascinating. Other sites, Pushpagiri, Adantapuri, and Somsapara. Somsapara is in modern Bangladesh. Are these major centers of learning, these huge universities that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years and served as major centers of education in India. Some of these are very centralized, some of these are very sort of widespread. Just to name a few of very, very many. But Buddhist universities are deeply fascinating, and this is just very, very interesting. Please excuse the sudden change in location. I made a boneheaded decision to record this while I was in the middle of traveling. Um, we will resume with our conversation around Muslim traditional education, religious education in India. Um, Muslims are a relatively late addition to the Indian religious diasporic community. They arrive generally on the scene in the 10th century. And relatively quickly, within 300 years, by 1206, have established a power base, the Delhi Sultanate, as a major political force and sort of truly the dominant major political force in India, especially northern India, within 300 years of their arrival into the scene. In that intervening 300 years, there are a great many Muslims in India, and their primary method of education is very similar to the Hindu Gurukul in a system that they call maktab. Maktabs are similarly very, very localized relationships between a priest, in this case a Molvi, um, and and the children within their community. Maktabs are very much centric around teacher-student relationships, and what is especially interesting about maktabs in these small-scale local formats is that they are not exclusive to boys. This is actually some of the most eager and most accepting form of education that we see, especially this early on in the timeline. Females are not excluded from learning at these maktabs. Where students can pick up Arabic language skills, where they can develop their understanding of Islamic cultural practices, rituals, and ceremonies, as well as standard sort of recitation of Quranic passages. Maktabs were broadly funded by their community. They generally only existed in communities where mosques were, or at least where a broad enough community of Muslims were banding together in prayer, in collective prayer. So they were plentiful, and they were very much community organized, community supported, and community funded. Maktabs are a fascinating bit of really localized education. So if maktabs are our primary school, our elementary education space, um, we see the evolution of the madrasa system. And madrasas are similar to high school and universities, where they are these facilities that offer a much more comprehensive Islamic curricula for those seeking to enter into the bureaucratic system, to be a member of the court, or a lawyer, or a practitioner of science. Madrasas are very much these centers of Islamic learning. In these places, we see a heavy focus on the expansion of Persian and Arabic language skills, a heavy focus on Islamic law, and especially beyond the Quranic recitation that was learned in the maktabs, we see Islamic Quranic commentary is a very big part of education in these madrasas. madrasas were substantially less common than maktabs, but were much, much larger and can service a substantially larger student population. They were very frequently publicly funded, usually, especially once we get into the period of the Delhi Sultanate, funded through royal charter, and very much affiliated with the crown. This gets even more pronounced later into the successor state of the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire, which picks up between the 15th century and the 18th century when the British Empire come into the scene. Um, uh, the madrasa system is formed into the very much the backbone of the higher education scene in India. By this time, a lot of the Buddhist monastic universities that we had talked about briefly earlier had fallen into disrepair or had fallen away, frankly, not unrelated to the expansion of the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire, both Muslim territorial militaristic forces. So very much the madrasa system becomes that, fills that vacuum, that space in the higher education sphere. And very much the scope of what is understood to be the principle of madrasas evolves over time, especially under the reign of Akbar the First, Akbar the Great, one of these enlightened Mughal emperors, who has a very heavy focus on education and expands the madrasa system to now include courses in ethics, mathematics, astronomy, government and agriculture, medicine, logic, as well as a comprehensive study of Sanskrit, one of the sort of ancient uh, Indian languages. Pardon my pause. A really heavy focus on learning and Sanskrit, so that a lot of these older is not Islamic, excuse me. A lot of these older Indian and Vedic texts can very much be learned, grown from, and expanded on to sort of build into this greater mythology of Indian sort of syncretism under the Mughal Empire. Before we move into the colonial period and our discussion on Christianity as a tool for cultural erasure, language erasure, I want to briefly make a note that in a broad sense, education during this time period was very much, unless explicitly noted, was very much reserved for men. Women were very much excluded from the process of education, from access to education. We see a little bit of that experience in maktabs, which allowed for girls to participate in some of their cultural proceedings and their understanding of religious ceremony. A very select few women were allowed to be part of Buddhist monastic tradition and to study to be monks. They were heavily regulated, and their experience was not at all similar to the education that was being received by men and boys who were training to be monks. One notable exception to this, which I wish I had more time to expand upon, are the Jains. Jains are a religious minority group and an early offshoot of Hinduism, which is generally originated in South India, and Jainist boys and girls generally did experience their religious schooling in a co-educational space, and that has been the case for a very long time. The Jains are a fascinating group and individual religious group, and I do wish that I had time to discuss them further. There are a great number of religious groups that I did not have the time to cover here. Sikhism is another massive contingent that I did not have time to cover. They are based mostly in the northern Indian and Pakistani region of Punjab. Um, Fascinating group as well. There are so many that I could spend time on, but I chose to dedicate time and space to our major three in the interest of time. The story of Christianity in India does not begin with the British. In fact, there is evidence that Christian communities have existed in the subcontinent since as early as the 4th century, perhaps earlier. And truly, even within the colonial era, Portuguese Jesuit missionaries and traders have been administering the small port region of Goa in central western India for several hundred years prior to the arrival of British Christian missionaries through the East India Trading Company. That being said, the vast majority of Christian influence and the lasting impact of Christian missionaries are absolutely wrought through the story of the East India Trading Company. The East India Trading Company arrived into the sphere of India in the early 1600s, though it would not become a regional hegemonic power until the late 1700s with the establishment of the seat of power in Bengal, in West Bengal, by Governor General William Hastings. And even still, it would not be until almost 40, 50 years later, until 1813, that we truly saw the first Christian missionaries enter into the scene. 1813 is a particularly important year. We saw then a contract negotiation between the British Crown and the East India Company that was important for two primary reasons. Like I said, this contract negotiation was the first opportunity for Christian missionaries to enter into and begin proselytizing in India after they were previously banned in the original contracts organized by the East India Company. The second primary reason that the 1813 contract renegotiation was particularly important is that it established and explicitly adopted a duty to educate the peoples of India. And along with this duty to educate, there became an ideological debate amongst the top brass of the East India Company about the implementation of this mandate, and even more specifically about the language of instruction that they chose to administer this mandate under. The primary mover of this campaign, probably the most important member of this campaign, was a man by the name of Thomas Macaulay. Thomas Macaulay was a member of the Governor General's Council, as well as a member of the House of Commons, member of the British Parliament, and he would emerge as the sort of leading figure in this educational reform, this particular version of educational reform. Macaulay called for a civilizing mission to bring English culture, language, and etiquette, among others, to the people of India, primarily through the erasure of traditional Indian modes of thought, modes of understanding, and local dialectic languages. The first waves of Macaulaysm, the advancement of Macaulaysm, began as an aggressive campaign of expansion of Christian missionary and convent schools across the subcontinent, but especially in British occupied strongholds, Bengal, Lucknow, Pondicherry, and Bombay. So these places of centralized power for the East India Company, where they had long established autonomy and regional control. The outcry that was created as these sort of Christian education opportunities is a bad word, but Christian education campaigns began was particularly hostile, especially among the Hindu community, as Christian missionaries began these operations of forced conversions and a system of compulsory education within these convent schools. I wanted to make a brief comment on the effectiveness of these convent schools, on these and these missionary schools. They were run by religious individuals, monks and nuns, Christian nuns and monks, who only spoke English and placed a very firm emphasis on English language learning. So movement away from indigenous language teachings and an emphasis on European literature. Macaulay himself stated once that a single shelf of English literature is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Baffling. But the sort of religious and linguistic teachings that take place within these schools are used to create dissonance, to build a wall between Indians and to support the broad strategy of colonial powers, creating separation from the traditional language to separate them from the language of their culture, from the languages that their traditional religions have been taught in or wrote in, creates distance and separation from cultural values. And in doing so, the English populace and the colonized governance create a class of people, wealthy elite individuals who have access to the upper crust of society, who are now sympathetic to their ideas and are indoctrinated into their cult of personality surrounding British domination, English superiority, and the supremacy of Christian ideals. Probably the most public admission of the intention to spread Anglicanism and Christianity into the Indian populace came from the Queen herself. In 1858, Queen Victoria was issuing a proclamation in which the British royal crown officially subsumed the administration of the Indian territories from the East India Trading Company and placed India officially into the subject of the British Crown, which was the beginning of what would be known as the British Raj period. During this proclamation, the Queen stated that it should breathe feelings of generosity and benevolence and religious fervor. And she also pointed out that the privileges with which Indians should feel and receive on being welcomed as subjects of the British Crown. She stated that they would be treated in equality with the remainder of the subjects of the British Crown, which is a ludicrous claim to make, but equating that feeling of that privilege, that generosity and that benevolence that should come with feelings of religious fervor now that they are truly and officially members of British society. I thought that one was particularly on the nose. One thing of note in the consideration of the British colonial education system, and especially its choice of English as its primary language, is that despite this fact, and perhaps because of the size and diversity of language and population in India, um, it failed to truly supplant local dialects as the sort of main language, the language of state, um, outside of court proceedings and official documents. Um, Unlike a situation perhaps like South Africa, where Zulu languages and indigenous languages were very much supplanted and overthrown. India's local dialects and its broader link to its culture through its language was able to remain intact. Um, this sort of reading about this and the sort of struggles of the English colonial actors to enforce these colonialized language ideas onto the English population very much reminded me of a video that we watched for class, Dr. Loazi Lishaba's Outcomes of a Colonial Education System, in which he is remarking on the loss of Zulu and other indigenous languages in South Africa, and sort of lamenting the this distance from his culture and traditional ways of thinking and systems of knowing that the people, the Black people of South Africa, are grappling with in the case of this dissonance from their own understanding of their cultures and sort of the imposition of English in that structure of understanding. So very much that was the attempt for how Macaulayism and the remainder of sort of British colonial actors and Christian missionary systems intended for the Indian people, but through probably a number of conglomerated reasons, that did not meet its full intended effect. I have gone distinctly over time in my scope and scale that I originally intended in this video, so I want to briefly and quickly transition into the post-colonial landscape and bring us to a relatively quick conclusion. But in its post-independence, in the post-partition India, most importantly, what we see is that uh, British colonial India is broken down into distinctly Hindu and Muslim nations, being India and Pakistan, and what is what was originally Western Pakistan, but um, is now Bangladesh, um, into religiously divided territories. And so on the Indian side, what both of these new nations, all three of these new nations, truly attempted to do was to create now a nationalist ideology, to create and instill a spirit of national pride in these newfound sort of old colonies out of sort of the shells of what they had been and had been stripped of. Um, uh, India declares an emphasis on science and technology to grow as a nation. Scientific temperament is literally written into its constitution. Um, so the advancements of higher institutes of learning in science and engineering, these are primary objectives of the new Indian state, this modern India, this idea of modern India, Jesus. What comes out of that system is, in many ways, a recreation and almost a caricature of Western ideas of education and sort of this uh, notion that this new and improved system of education, uh, and the term saffronization in reference to the saffron-colored robes that Hindu ascetics wear. This saffronization of education um, still lends itself mostly to the form and framework that is created in the British colonial education system, rather than truly honoring to the roots um, of traditional Hindu education, either in the Gurukul or in the Pathshala system that I did not exactly have time to bring into this discussion. Um, that being said, most education is a pathway to understanding, and it is a reflection of the sort of ideology and nature of a nation. And so it is understanding that a newly reformed nation that is still shaking off the bones of its past is still built into the framework and still very much shares the same bones of its former states. In more recent years, the national federal policy of education in India has taken some dramatic overhauls. In 2020, the National Education Policy, NEP, received a substantial revision after it was originally developed in 1986 and revised again in 1992. This is a significant update that brings the federal system of education in India into a truly modern capacity. The NEP is an articulation of the mission and purpose of education within India. And to quote, it says, the NEP aims at producing engaged, productive, and contributing citizens for the building of an equitable, inclusive, and plural society as envisioned by the Constitution. Um, to detail briefly some of its more poignant inclusions, most dramatically, the expansion of early childhood education to begin at age 3, as opposed to where it currently stands at age 6, is a dramatic expansion of general accessibility for early childhood education. Um, Secondarily, and probably most importantly throughout this document, there is an entire section to the inclusion of what they term socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, girls, transgender individuals, children with special needs, Dalits, and victims of trafficking. Um, these are massively underrepresented groups in terms of advancement and opportunity within India. It also acknowledges that students with disability are not receiving services that they need to truly succeed in schools, and addresses some goals to better equip teachers in schools with the tools they need to provide for those special education students and students with disabilities. And lastly, it greatly expands on the concept of quality. What does a quality education mean in India? Overall, this is a deeply progressive document from the Indian federal government. That being said, what remains is the effective and equitable implementation of such a bold and progressive goal. So that remains very much to be seen, but I laud the creators and hope for the best that this does bring significant change to the quality of education received to students in India. Before we wrap up today, I just wanted to acknowledge some brief limitations in my understanding, as well as some hopes for potential opportunities for further research in the future. I mentioned this previously, but I would love to have sought out and understood a better understanding of outcomes for the education of women and girls, particularly in the colonial and post-colonial space, as that has developed over time, as well as a broader understanding of the late British Raj period, which is admittedly a section of history and understanding that I did not have an opportunity to delve into as deeply as I would have liked. Um, Additionally, another avenue of research that may have been fruitful in this conversation was the expansion of my understanding of indigenous copings and forms of knowledge in the immediate post-partition space, and how different and various communities began and grappled with their newfound independence, as well as sort of the nation building aspect in the return um, to form in the post-independent space. All of these are deeply important to me, as well as potentially a more in-depth research into Jainists, Sikhism, and a broader understanding of religious minorities in the broader context of this sort of religious education space. All of these are fascinating opportunities for further research, and I wish that I could have included them here without making this video several hours long. Thank you for your patience and your understanding, and I hope that you have enjoyed. What I want to end with today is just a brief commentary on why I chose this topic to begin with and why this is a very particularly important topic for me. This topic came out of a conversation that I am currently having with my partner, who is Indian, who is South Indian. Um, and it just so happens that at the time of recording this, um, I am preparing to speak to my partner's parents to ask for their blessing um, for our proposal, for our engagement. Um, this conversation very much came out of conversations that we were having about why it is important to me as a white man and an outsider into this culture to be supportive and to raise our potential future children in Hindu and truly traditional Indian traditions and culture. Why it's important to me that these cultures are upheld and not lost, and that assimilation, even if it means the participation in Christian cultures that my family are a part of, or a participation in a Catholic school that may be available in our neighborhood that I may teach at or work at. Why those conversations and context is important to me, especially as I move into this very tension heavy conversation with her parents about worthiness and tradition and coming into this culture as an outsider. All of those colored the main motivations for this research today, and I hope with that added context that you have a glimpse as to why such of these topics and understanding was particularly poignant for me. If you have made it this far, that's unbelievably brilliant. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And I hope that it has been enlightening for you, at least mildly entertaining and not terribly boring. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely day.